Brotherhoods of Spanish penitents, wearing the shrouds in which they will be buried, have passed on their sacred burden from father to son for centuries. They still keep faith with the old religion, the religion which Castile carried through a fracturing world in the growing chaos of the 16th century. The city of Avila in central Castile. In the 16th century, this was a land made rich by vast flocks of sheep. It is well over 200 miles to the sea. The church of Son Solis, just beyond the walls, is an ancient chapel of thanksgiving. Over the centuries, people of Avila with special reason to give thanks have made votive offerings here. No one remembers the seaman who gave thanks here for his safe return. But galleons like this sailed in the doomed Armada that came against England in 1588. For thousands of sailors in that fleet, the story of the Armada ended here, when their ships were smashed on the Irish coast. Now these ships are being discovered and explored. They are revealing how the men on board them lived and how they died. The commander of those ships was the Duke of Medina Sidonia. The present Duchess of Medina Sidonia lives in his palace. She is still the highest-ranking aristocrat in southern Spain, though she happens to vote communist. For many years, she has been cataloguing and examining the letters which passed between her ancestor and the king. And in these films, she speaks out for the first time to show that the image of the Armada as a mighty and irresistible force is completely wrong.
Está que la historia, pues no sé, bueno, sí, es política. Y al ser política, pues, sobre todo en España, se disfraza mucho. Cogido crónicas en que los documentos prueban claramente que están que están falseadas.
At the village of Simancas, a 15th century castle houses the official Spanish archives. The labors of government bureaucrats have been carefully preserved, but for centuries they were largely ignored by historians. The story of the Armada has been told using second-hand accounts and incomplete transcripts. But now historians are hard at work in the Spanish records. The result has been to revolutionize our understanding of the Armada. Out of the archives are coming radically new answers to the old questions. Why did the Armada fail? How near did it come to succeeding? And what might have happened? And some very private documents have now come to light. This is a private palace in a back street in Madrid. Here is an archive which contains the most intimate thoughts of Philip II, scribbled notes to his chaplain. For the first time, for the making of this film, these letters have been revealed. One of them is dated the 10th of November, 1588, when Philip had realized the fate of his armada. They were very nearly lost to posterity. Indeed, lost to a posterior.
In the middle of the 19th century, the Royal Palace Archives in Madrid were thrown out in order to make a court palace theatre. Most of the documents were preserved. Some, however, by mistake, were put in sacks and put out for waste paper. What exactly happens next, we don't know, until one day, some years later, a Spanish nobleman, the Count of Altamira, walking down a Madrid street, is taken short. He dives into the nearest shop, goes into the toilet, notices that the toilet paper is covered with Philip II holograph. He puts his head out the door, asks for cleaner toilet paper, eventually gets it, and when he emerges, waves the pad of paper and asks, have they got any more? Yes, they said 3 sacks of it. We had 6 sacks, but we've been using it. And the Count says, well, I would like it. They ask him what then they can use for toilet paper, and the Count offers them 3 sacks of clean paper in return for the 3 sacks of Philip II holograph. Here they are.
Marked for your eyes only, these papers open a window into the mind of Philip II, the mind that shaped the Armada. They show a man convinced that he was the instrument of God's purpose, acting in the name of a higher destiny, the historic destiny of the Catholic king. For the Armada was the last crusade to be mounted by a kingdom that had been carved out by religious crusades. For centuries, the Catholic kings of Spain had led a Christian war against Islam. Spain had been won inch by inch from its Muslim rulers. It had once been a land of minarets and mosques. They imposed a single, unified culture, forcing conversion to Christianity. The victorious Crusaders ripped out the center of Cordoba's mosque in the 13th century and replaced it by a cathedral. For the Spanish nobility, it was an ancient tradition to conquer for the true faith. The rulers of Spain had their own Inquisition, more intense than the Inquisition of the Pope. Philip II surrounded himself with images of martyrdom. His palace, the Escorial, is dedicated to St. Lawrence and shaped like the gridiron on which the saint was said to be martyred. Partly a mausoleum for his ancestors, partly a monastery, it is a symbol of centralized authority on a barren hillside in the geographical center of Spain. And the heart of the palace shelters the relics of almost every saint in Christendom.
La historia ha reconocido en el rey Felipe II el rey católico, pero además de ser un gran rey católico fue un hombre profundamente religioso. Así lo demuestra este relicario que tenemos aquí en la Real Basílica del Monasterio del Escorial. Felipe II trajo estas reliquias desde los distintos puntos de la cristiandad, buscando quizá ayuda en la protección de los santos.
Their heads contain the skulls of martyrs, the golden limbs contain their bones. It was an obsession. He collected 7,000 fragments of corpses. Philip's own rooms are directly behind the cupboard of relics. The entrance is on the right of the altar. He lived on God's doorstep. This is Philip II's idea of an ideal home. It is his design for perfect living. And right next to the bedroom, also opening onto the altar, was the office from which he governed most of the world.
From this tiny cubicle in the heart of Castile, Philip II ruled an empire on which the sun, quite literally, never set. Across this desk, at which the king would work for 10, 12, 14 hours a day throughout the summer of 1588, passed a mountain of letters, papers, and memorials. The king tried to read them all personally. All outgoing letters in his name he signed personally. And those documents, important or unimportant, which he read, he would annotate and, if necessary, correct. Here we have an example of a syntax error, which the king has written a large amount about, trying to clarify, trying to simplify, suggesting an improvement. These letters were important. They were dispatched to Flanders and to Lisbon, to the commanders of the Armada. The fate of the Grand Fleet depended upon them.
No detail was too small for his attention. He carried an overwhelming responsibility. The burden of faith had a meaning in the Escorial which is forgotten to most of us now, in Spain as elsewhere. But in this Spanish village, the weight of the cross is literally carried as Philip seems to have carried it metaphorically. He described himself as a slave with a crown and carried the entire burden of the empire in the name of his responsibility under God. That empire was vast and growing. He was ruler of the Netherlands, of Franche-Comté, of Milan and Naples. And he was also ruler of the new lands discovered in Central and South America, the lands of gold. It was the lure of gold that originally drew men from far inland to the ocean and turned Spain's crusade westwards. Precious metals poured into Spain for their own conversion.
Las piezas de oro, por su valor intrínseco, pues ha traído pues su propia destrucción, porque sus contemporáneos no han sabido respetar artísticamente la obra, sino han ido a su valor intrínseco. Y esto hace que hacia nosotros hayan llegado pocos objetos.
Most of the gold became coins, golden raindrops which evaporated from Spain and condensed in the pockets of foreign financiers. But enough precious metal remained to make Seville a city of gold and silver and of craftsmen who worked it.
Sevilla fue una ciudad donde entraba el oro en el siglo XVI y la plata en los galeones a Sevilla. Inmediatamente en Sevilla se forjaba de los lingotes, se convertían en chapa, inmediatamente se repujaba y se convertían en objetos que eran generalmente objetos religiosos.
The Reredos of Seville Cathedral was completed in the 1560s. It had taken 80 years to beat out the solid gold. By the year it was finished, the flow of gold from America was almost over. But in 1545, a great hill of silver had been discovered at Potosí in Bolivia, and this became the key to the finances of the King of Spain. In Europe and across the Atlantic, the Spanish monarchy offered a vision of Christendom restored and enlarged under Spanish leadership. One faith, one justice, one destiny, for many races in many continents. England might have been part of this vision. England's Queen, Mary Tudor, had married Philip in 1554, but she died 4 years later. Philip proposed to Elizabeth, but she turned him down and became a Protestant. England became an outsider.
This is not an original, but a copy that represents the first circumnavigation of the world in 1522. And as you see, in this copy, they try to do the things the same as in the 16th century used to do the map makers. You can see that Africa is already well known, and also Asia and America, the new lands of America. And if you notice, in Europe, the British Islands are missing. That's why, because the object of this map is to show only the route of the first circumnavigation, trying to find a better route to come back from the islands of the spices.
And is Britain not worth representing?
No, it's not. It's not because Britain was not important at that time. It wasn't important. It was locally important, but not was important in a wider sense. As you know, the world was divided at that time into two principal powers. The one was Portugal, and the other one was Spain.
But that did not mean that the English really had no place on the map. Ruffians like Martin Frobisher, John Hawkins, and Francis Drake made their fortunes by forcing their way into the trade of the New World at gunpoint. Queen Elizabeth began to go into partnership with them in piratical raids on the convoys. Both Spain and Portugal had treasure fleets coming from the New World, but after 1580, Philip was the sovereign of all of them. In that year, the King of Portugal died. A Spanish war fleet sailed into Lisbon harbor, and a land army moved in from Spain. It was a walkover. Philip was the new King of Portugal. Portugal's overseas colonies now became Philip's. The world outside Europe had been divided between both countries. Now Philip laid claim to the largest empire the world has ever seen, and his naval commander was lifted out of the Mediterranean and offered the greatest stage in history to play out his ambitions. That was the Marquis of Santa Cruz. He was the architect of all Philip's greatest victories at sea. Like the Escorial, Santa Cruz's palace is far inland. 150 miles from the coast, the courtyard is covered with frescoes of ships and sea battles. So far, he had commanded Mediterranean fleets, and his arena had been that of the heroes of classical antiquity. He has himself portrayed in this palace as Mars, the god of war. Now, for the first time, he commanded an ocean fleet, and he took it to war in the Atlantic. The islands of the Azores had been part of the Portuguese Empire. Now they were defended by France and England. Santa Cruz took them in an amphibious assault. His galleons defeated the defending warships and put ashore a massive force in landing craft. This was a brilliant and wholly new technique, and it was a resounding success. The Hall of Battles in the King's Palace illustrates the history of Spain's military crusade. It culminates with the Azores landings. Santa Cruz had at his disposal one of the most effective fighting forces in Europe. The troops that he now wanted to use to crown that story of conquest by reaching out to take England. There are people in Spain who still celebrate those troops.
¿Sabes que estás solicitando el ingreso en la Orden del Mar Océano?
Sí.
¿Sabes que te comprometes a defender el honor de España en cualquier lugar y en cualquier circunstancia en todo el mundo?
Juro.
This is the Order of the Ocean Sea, or the Order of the High Seas. It's an organization that commemorates the presence and the heroic acts of the Spanish Marine Corps all over the world.
Presente.
Ships had always carried soldiers to battle their way onto enemy vessels. The Marine Corps was a natural extension of this, an amphibious force that had captured the Azores and could now storm England.
Mosquetero Jaime Sánchez Villar, ¿sabes que has solicitado tu ingreso en el tercio del Mar Océano?
Sí.
¿Sabes que te comprometes y vas a jurar respetar la bandera de España en cualquier lugar del mundo y en cualquier época?
Sí.
Philip showed little interest in turning his forces to war with England. He preferred to back plots for Elizabeth's assassination, but the plots failed, and the English became ever more of a nuisance. In 1586, Drake launched his most devastating raid on Spain's Caribbean empire. His first target was the island of Hispaniola, the island which Columbus had first settled. By now, its gold had been exhausted, its native population were all dead. When the town could not pay the ransom Drake demanded, he burned it down. From there, he sailed to Cartagena, the main shipping port for American treasure. He stormed the town and demolished nearly 250 houses. Elizabeth was one of the backers of this voyage and was disappointed only to get back 15 shillings for every pound she had invested. The Caribbean began to build defenses against the English pirates. While Sir Walter Raleigh wrote, "The way to humble the Spanish greatness is by cutting off the Spanish sinews of war, his money from the West Indies." Money stolen from Spain helped to pay for her jewels, her dresses, and her ships. And then, as well as financing terrorism from the sea, she began supplying help to rebels inside Philip's dominions. The Netherlands, not England, was Philip's biggest problem. He was the ruler here, but his subjects rose in rebellion in the 1560s, and that rebellion seemed endless. This was the most urbanized area of Europe and a great center of commercial prosperity. The Low Countries were officially Catholic. This was the original heart of Philip's inheritance. But it was also the center of printing and of the distribution of new ideas. Once people were reading and discussing ideas for themselves, they were less likely to follow established authority. It's an old cliche that the printing press shattered the power of the Catholic Church, and it's true. Protestantism flourished in the Low Countries, and Philip the Catholic King tried very hard to stamp it out.
Of course, many people, merchants especially, but also wealthy craftsmen, were opposed to Philip II's crackdown on Protestants, not for religious reasons, but because this persecution impeded trade.
Philip's father, Charles V, had set himself to destroy Protestantism. When he confronted Luther, he spelled that out.
It is certain that a single monk must err if he stands against the opinion of all Christendom. Otherwise, Christendom itself would have erred for more than 1,000 years. Therefore, I am determined to set my kingdoms and my dominions, my friends, my body, my blood, my life, my soul upon it.
But Charles had been broken in the effort. Now the responsibility was taken up by Philip.
He was a king in a profoundly Catholic country, Spain, as Portugal was, and the largest part of Italy was. So for him, living in a country where Catholicism had never been challenged, where individuals were sometimes regarded by the Inquisition as heretics, but were not any threat to that religion. For such a king, whether Philip II or another man, it simply couldn't be understood what was happening in Western Europe. The only thing he could see was there are heretics, more and more heretics, and that movement has to be stopped, if necessary, by the force of arms.
I would sacrifice all my lands and lose 100 lives if I had them, rather than be a sovereign of heretics.
Spanish troops were sent to fight the heretics. And at towns like Zutphen, they found themselves having to do battle with the whole population. At Zutphen and at Naarden, Spanish troops were ordered to kill everyone. They did. These were object lessons in terror, to induce others to abandon any thought of revolt. They were well publicized, as they were meant to be. This deliberate policy of ruthless brutality would be remembered across the whole of Europe and created a deep impression in England. Everything that moved was killed, and the Spanish commander reported to his king, "Nothing can be accomplished by clemency."
The unity of the one and only Christian church had been broken, and for always. Nothing could stop that process, and it was a process not particular to the Low Countries. It was also noticeable in England, in Central Europe, in France, everywhere. So Philip II tried, as a matter of fact, to stop an enormously broad movement, an historical process. And that was impossible, except by the force of arms.
Even the force of arms was not enough. Despite sending thousands of men and all the coin he could raise, Philip found that he controlled an ever-shrinking area. The army's commander-in-chief had to be removed. His parting advice was to turn the Netherlands into a wasteland of death. Bruegel's triumph of death was painted immediately before these terrible years and seems to presage what took place. Then a new commander was sent, the Duke of Parma. He combined careful strategy with greater insight. Parma stopped the massacres and offered towns security and money to come back into the fold, and the tide turned. But in 1585, Elizabeth stepped in to give heart to the dwindling rebel forces. She sent money, she sent men, she sent a commander, the Earl of Leicester, to help the rebels. And the Dutch rebels gave him the title Governor-General of the Netherlands.
All in all, you could say that the English help didn't prove very important. But apparently, Philip II thought it was important. And for that reason, he decided to send the Armada to England to stop the English intervention.
No one can say how hard it would have been to topple the Queen of England. Today, we assume it would have been very difficult. But what we see of Elizabeth's England was an image which she shaped most carefully. We do not even know what the Queen looked like. We only see what she wanted to be seen. To paint a portrait of Elizabeth, the painter had to make a stencil from an officially approved image. From time to time, artist studios were raided and portraits which differed from the official image were destroyed. Once the stencil had been made, the artist had to lay it on a canvas and dab over it with a bag of chalk dust. He had to show her as she meant to look, and that is how we see the land she ruled as well. The image we have now of Elizabethan England is of a staunch Protestant country united behind its queen. But what has been handed down to us is the mask of Elizabethan propaganda. The facade of Hengrave Hall in Sussex proclaims the loyalty of a merchant family in Elizabeth's England. It is decorated with the royal arms and the royal motto. But behind the image was a Catholic family. The wife was imprisoned for her faith. At every level of English society, there were hidden surprises.
The English Catholics had on their side the most outstanding composer in Britain, William Byrd. Byrd was officially employed by the Queen, which meant that normally he would spend his time writing works that the Queen herself would have sanctioned. And for example, when the Armada was finally off the coast of Britain, she herself wrote a little poem which was set to music by Byrd that was all about the weather dispersing the ships and thanking God for that. But Byrd himself was a Catholic, and he spent most of his time, his free time, with the Catholic nobility. And for them, he wrote motets which would express the Catholic's point of view.
Which included a motet whose Latin words amount to a coded message of joy as the Armada approached. It was almost certainly sung in this house in 1588. Elizabeth saw to it that England presented a mask of public unity, but behind it, everything was equivocal.
The system today for painting members of the royal family is totally different from what we've experienced, certainly in the Tudor period, in that our own royal family are very much more enlightened as to the portraits that are now acceptable. I think if the Queen was very positive and said, Mr. Poole, I would really like to be painted in this particular way, I would say, yes, ma'am, I will do exactly as you would. I think it's very rare that this would, in fact, happen. I think one would discuss it and point out if there were real disadvantages in that and it would produce a less successful portrait, then one would say so.
16th century monarchs were firmer. Elizabeth was not likely to face a Catholic rebellion in 1588, but she may have had less popular support than we tend to think. One sign of her weakness was the execution in 1587 of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, next in line to the throne, was a Catholic. Philip's involvement in assassination plots had made it necessary to chop off Mary's head. Elizabeth always drew back from the brink of full-scale war. She could not afford it. But there was a war party in England, and Drake belonged to it. As a deliberate provocation, he raided the northwest coast of Spain itself. He attacked the fishing villages of Galicia and raided Vigo and Bayona, its largest towns.
The news from Galicia was the last straw for Philip II. Coming on top of English piracy on the high seas, English intervention in the Netherlands, now the soil of Spain had been desecrated. And within a week of Drake's departure from Vigo, Philip II had written to the Pope, committing himself irrevocably to the invasion of England. The problem was how best to accomplish it. He therefore turned to his two senior commanders, to the Marquis of Santa Cruz, to the Duke of Parma, and asked them both to devise a plan for the invasion and destruction of the Tudor state.
This was the dizzying moment Santa Cruz had been waiting for. The opportunity to crown a glittering career with a conquest that would ring down the ages. He was an old man, but he was ready. His proposal was delivered in a few weeks. He wanted a force of 600 ships, the largest naval force in the history of the world. He envisaged an assault just like the one he had mounted in the Azores, an armada powerful enough to sweep the seas clear, carrying a landing force large enough to overwhelm the English army.
Parma replied rather later, and his plan was totally different. This time it would involve the army of Flanders, waiting in the Netherlands, fighting the Dutch. A large 30,000-man force would be detached and hurled across the Channel to make a lightning blitzkrieg attack on London. The king pondered the two plans, so different, and yet both so convincing. Which was the better? Which should he choose? In the end, he seems to have felt, since there was money enough for both plans, why not combine them and do both at once? Combine the fleet from Spain with the army from the Netherlands. A junction in the Channel, a combined assault on London.
When the royal decision was issued, both commanders were outraged. Santa Cruz had wanted the glory of being the conqueror of England. Philip had given him a much less glorious task, and only a quarter of the force he wanted. Now he was simply an escort to the Duke of Parma and his army. Parma was convinced that the English had to be taken by surprise, and the preparation of a great fleet would destroy that prospect. He really wanted to finish off the Dutch. He didn't want a divided command, and he did not want to keep an army hanging about for a fleet that might perhaps arrive one day, sometime, with his reinforcements. But Philip ordered them both to stop protesting and get on with it. Assemble the army and have it ready for embarkation. Gather the fleet and all its supplies. He had thrown away the two plans and combined the army and the navy into a new operation of his own, to be run from his desk.
One wonders if he ever realized the enormity of the change, the strategic leap which he had just made. To combine two forces that were 1,000 sea miles apart required excellent planning, excellent coordination, and a great deal of luck. But whether or not he realized it, he got down to work. Almost immediately, the detailed planning began, lists being drawn up of everything that should be taken on the Grand Fleet, down to the last pair of shoes and the last knife and fork.
To produce everything needed for such a vast enterprise involved all of Spain. Simple cottage industries were not geared to producing goods on such a scale. Government agents were sent out with specific demands from each region. Members of almost every noble family in Spain volunteered for the campaign. It offered glory and advancement. But as in England, the national myth masks the truth. At least the truth as the ordinary soldiers understood it.
Nadie iba contento a ninguna empresa, y hay que tener en cuenta una cosa, que los soldados españoles de la época, los castellanos, en ninguna guerra participaron con el corazón alegre. Eran pagados, se escaqueaban en cuanto podían, y en cuanto se hablaba de levas, la gente o se casaba o se iban.
That lack of enthusiasm spread. Then, while the equipment was being accumulated, Drake raided Cadiz harbor. He sailed right in and destroyed over 24 ships with all their stores. Preparations were put back many months. Soon you could get odds of 6 to 1 in Paris that the Armada would never go anywhere. From the end of September 1587, Philip was ordering the Armada to leave port and telling Parma to be ready for its imminent arrival. But Santa Cruz kept saying that he wasn't ready. The king started to think that the ships would never leave Lisbon. In December 1587, he wrote to Parma telling him to attack England on his own. In fact, he demanded to know why he hadn't invaded already. Parma had always said that an invasion could only succeed if it was done swiftly and with surprise, and he had been told to be quiet and wait. Now he lost his temper completely.
Your Majesty is perfectly well aware that without the support of this fleet, I could not cross over to England with the boats I have here, and you very prudently ordered me not to do so until the Marquis arrived. Your Majesty has the right to give absolute orders, which I receive as special favors and execute. But for you to write to me now with a proposal that runs so contrary to the previous express orders and command of Your Majesty causes me great anguish. I beg you humbly do me the very great favor of telling me what to do next.
By the end of January 1588, the great Marquis of Santa Cruz was, if not a fallen, at least a tottering idol. He was sick, and the Armada was stymied. Supplies were putrescent. Men were sick and dying. They were 300 mariners short. The ordnance was loaded on all the wrong ships. They were short of ships, short of everything. Philip II reacted to this situation in a characteristically bureaucratic fashion. He sent an investigator to prepare a report. And when Santa Cruz heard that the investigator, the Count of Fuentes, was on his way, he was stung into a last frenzy of activity which killed him.
In fact, by the time the Count arrived, the Marquis was so ill he could not understand who had come to see him. He read through the Count's letter of introduction 3 times, trying to concentrate on what it said.
The investigator's report was made. It was highly respectful, even reverential, towards this great sea captain of days gone by. But reading between the lines, one can infer, as the bureaucrats in Madrid would have inferred, that the Armada was in chaos. Within a few days, on the 9th of February, Fuentes reported to Madrid that Santa Cruz was dying, and the same day recorded his death, adding, "Now the Armada has need of a master who can control and manage it."
The man who received the summons to save the enterprise from disaster was the only man in Spain of high enough rank to command the aristocrats in the Armada. But the Duke of Medina Sidonia had never commanded a navy in his life.
Bueno, Medina Sidonia acepta porque no le queda más remedio. De momento rechaza. Organizar las armadas, organizó algunas veces las flotas de indias, pues se ocupaba de los bastimentos, de hacer la leva de gente, de supervisar, pero no tenía autoridad. Eso es una gran confusión. La autoridad era de los almirantes. Y hay muchas veces que se queja al rey y le dice, bueno, pero si es que yo no tengo autoridad, yo creo que esto está mal hecho, pero yo no puedo mandar que lo hagan. Yo tengo que convencer.
The Duchess's research shows that her ancestor did not expect to be an absolute command, but he was not a yes man. His letters to his king were extremely blunt. Philip wanted a fleet of about 130 ships. Even if he could pull the Armada back into shape, the Duke was convinced that was not enough.
Él le dice claramente a Felipe II que no tiene fuerzas para conquistar un reino, que es lo que pretende, conquistar Inglaterra, que con los 129, 130 barcos que lleva no puede, que además es desatinado.
Philip forbade any criticism, and Medina Sidonia, the dutiful and efficient administrator, got the show on the sea. He took the Armada out of Lisbon Harbour on the 28th of May, 1588. They sailed past the Tower of Belem, down the Tagus River, bound for Parma's army and the coast of England. They didn't get very far. They were hit by massive gales off northern Spain and were scattered. They eventually regrouped in Corunna, and Medina Sidonia had to start the fitting out all over again. And his letters to Philip were now emphatic that the whole enterprise should be called off.
Ir a cosas tan grandes con fuerzas iguales no convendría, cuanto más siendo inferiores como lo están, y la gente no tan plática como convendría, ni los oficiales, que por lo que en mi conciencia digo a vuestra majestad, que veo pocos o casi ninguno que entienda y sepa cumplir con las obligaciones de sus oficios. Y esto lo he experimentado y advertido con todo cuidado, y así crea vuestra majestad que esto está muy flaco y no engaña a vuestra majestad a nadie con decirle otra cosa.
Philip's secretaries concealed some of these letters. They dared not take them to their master. We now know that the king had come to the edge of collapse, racked with anxiety and exhaustion. For weeks at a time, in 1587 and 1588, he took to his bed incapable of governing. Yet without his approval, no one dared do anything. This manuscript portrait, made in 1588 and previously unknown, shows him tired and aging. No one around him would add to his burden.
Después de esta carta, Cristóbal de Mora, que era el válido del rey, le escribe una divertidísima al duque y dice: lo que más nos conviene es que vuestra señoría engorde y duerma y acabe de creer que no está obligado a dar cuenta de lo que el cielo ordena, sino conformarse con ello, pues allí se sabe mejor lo que nos conviene.
And so the work went on again. The battered ships were refitted and the rotting stores replaced. Philip roused himself enough to rebut all objections. No one would help the English. Their forces were not strong enough to resist the righteous. I have dedicated this enterprise to God. Get on with it. 125 ships, 30,000 men, eventually set sail. Some of the commanders shared Medina Sidonia's fears. The English would batter them with cannon from a distance. Some expected God to solve their problems. As one commander put it, we sail in the confident hope of a miracle. Now Philip's orders would play themselves out, the actors beyond reach of any further commands. The junction of his forces on land and sea and the destruction of Elizabeth Tudor was now in the hands of God. Or of the English.
Stay tuned for a look at the reality behind the fantasy of America's movie mecca on Naked Hollywood, next here on Channel 2.